Good morning, Mr. Gill.
Good morning, my lord. The first witness today is Danny Boyle,
Morning, Mr.
who
Boyle.
represents BEMIS.
Very good. Now, when you're ready, Mr. Gill.
Thank you. Mr. Boyle, your full name, please.
Daniel John Boyle.
Yeah. And the inquiry is aware of your details, so we don't need to go through that. You're here today to give evidence on behalf of BEMIS, and we'll come to what BEMIS is and your role in it in a moment. You provided us with a statement. The reference to that is SCIWT 0331 and then 501. You don't need to worry about that, but it'll come up on the screen as we go through your evidence. You've also provided us with some documents which you make reference to in the course of your statement. And the inquiry is very grateful to you for those documents. And I would want to assure you that all the documents you provided, together with all of your statement, will be taken into account as the inquiry goes forward. And I just confirm that so far as your statement is concerned, you've signed that statement and that you are content that it be taken forward as your evidence to this inquiry, together with the oral evidence that you give today.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, your role within BEMIS is as the Senior Parliamentary and Policy Officer with that organisation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I think you joined the organisation in 2010, as I think your title then was Capacity Development Officer.
Correct.
And you moved to the role that you have as a Parliamentary and Policy Officer in 2014, and then to the role of Senior Parliamentary and Policy Officer in 2018. Is that right?
Correct.
So, ergo, you were, in fact, you were in that position during the whole of the pandemic,
Correct.
And particularly the period at which this inquiry is interested in.
Correct.
Yep. Now, obviously, BEMIS is an acronym, and I think we take from your statement that BEMIS is essentially as old as devolution in Scotland. It came in round about the time of the establishment of the Parliament in Scotland in 1999.
That's correct.
And BEMIS stands for what?
So BEMIS's legal name presently is BEMIS, Empowering Ethnic and Cultural Minority Communities in Scotland. BEMIS as an acronym, initially when it was formed in 2000, used to stand for Black and Ethnic Minority Infrastructure Scotland. However, there was a discussion internally between the organisation and the board and members, I think around about 2008, 2009, to change that acronym to what it presently is, and that reflected their evolving understanding of race and ethnicity and the diversity of communities in Scotland who they were seeking to work with.
Now, this is an issue that you come back to on a number of occasions in your statement, because I think as we see in your statement, it's become relatively controversial. The departure from BEMIS as Black and Ethnic Minority Infrastructure Scotland to the title that you've given today, what was the reasoning and what is the continuing reasoning behind having that broader scope, as it were, for understanding what BEMIS is?
So I wasn't present when those internal discussions were occurring around about the change in the name. However, I'm aware from my work from being in BEMIS from 2014 onwards that they seek to comply with the legal definition of race as contained within the Equalities Act, which covers colour, nationality, ethnic or national origin. In addition, that definition is derived from the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which again covers similar provisions. That's not the sole reason with regards to that. There has obviously also been developments in recognition from within our membership, particularly led by people from African communities around about that time, I think 2008, 9, 10, that the racial classification of black, as they saw it, didn't appropriately reflect their ethnic diversity, the ethnic diversity of the different nationalities and groups who would be assumed to make up that particular racial classification. So while we recognise the very serious issue and pernicious issue of colour-based discrimination on the basis of skin colour, it was led by membership to change the acronym of Black and Ethnic Minority Infrastructure Scotland to the present name, supporting Scotland's ethnic and cultural minority communities, both to reflect the legal definition and also to reflect their evolving understanding of their self-ascribed ethnic and cultural identity in Scotland.
I think one of the, perhaps at the heart of this is the question of colour coding as indicating ethnicity. And one of the points that you make, and we'll look at it in more detail, for example, the Polish community in Scotland would be automatically colour-coded as white. And there wouldn't be that specific ethnicity given to, or might not be that specific ethnicity given to the Polish community if one was just using a colour coding.
Yeah, that is correct. Not just the Polish community, but they are a good example.
I use that as an example.
Yeah, they're a good example in terms of experiences during the pandemic. But yeah, what we often see with when duty bearers provide statistical evidence to give us an indication of a particular problem in the pandemic, for example, around about vaccination, the initial data indicated that the uptake within the white racial classification was not a concern and was good because around about 95% of people were taking the vaccination. But when actually disaggregated, that particular data showed that specifically within the Polish ethnic group, vaccination uptake was around about the 30 to 35% mark, and there was reasons for that which we can go into.
Well, we'll look at vaccination as a separate subject, but it is obviously something that goes through. Can we just return to your role in the organisation? Can I understand your role as a conduit between your organisation, and this during the pandemic, with both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament?
That's
correct. We begin, first of all, with the Government. Yeah,
so I would represent... well, prior to the pandemic, I would represent BEMIS on different Scottish Government strategic advisory boards or partnership groups, such as the Strategic Partnership on Tackling Hate Crime, the Human Rights Bill Advisory Board, as it was at the time, and we'd also be engaged in specific areas of consultation around about what may be policy priorities at any given time. That was all encapsulated pre-pandemic in what was known as the Race Equality Framework, 2016 to 2030, and the Race Equality Framework contained high-level policy ambitions with regards to health, education, community cohesion. So I would act as that conduit to provide evidence and engage in that particular format.
Just talk about the organisation of BEMIS. It's as you tell us, it's a charity, and you indicate that its board members are from different ethnic minority communities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. We're a democratic organisation. Our board is representative of communities protected under those provisions of colour, nationality, ethnic or national origin.
Yeah. And what, again, it's a point we'll come back to in a little. At the beginning of the pandemic, and I'll look in a moment at your understanding and the information that you were being fed by the various communities you represent, about the vulnerabilities of people at the beginning of the pandemic. I'll come to that in a moment. But at the beginning of the pandemic, you were a strategic organisation, if I can put it that way. You were not a service provider.
That's accurate.
Yeah, and I think we see that perhaps you had thrust on you to be a service provider as we progressed during the pandemic, particularly in the sense of providing sustenance funds to various organisations and individuals. Is that right?
Yeah, we identified in the months leading up to the pandemic, when it occurred in the UK, that there was going to be significant consequences for ethnic minority communities in Scotland, and as such, we identified that as an obligation to continue our pre-existing role around about strategic engagement, policy development and broad representation. But as with so many others, the pandemic catalysed a necessity to provide additional services, which were much more frontline, as in providing financial support to people.
Yeah. Now, can I just pick up two things with you? You do have a section in your statement on effectively pre-pandemic planning. From that, it's only a very brief section in your statement. BEMIS was not involved in any pre-pandemic planning prior to this COVID pandemic starting in 2020.
No.
With the benefit now of hindsight, and were there to be another pandemic of a similar nature, would you advise or recommend that BEMIS, or an organisation such as you, and obviously you're an umbrella organisation, be involved in pre-pandemic planning and any planning for such a pandemic as it comes?
Yes, very much so. The dynamics which made people more susceptible to either contracting or transmitting the virus were there. We knew about those prior to the pandemic occurring, around about population density, elderly population, so on and so forth. So, it should be a basic learning for all of us in the Scottish Government that to prepare for such eventualities in the future, you want to have as much detailed and clear evidence of possible outcomes as possible, and that would include engaging and understanding the different variations of circumstances which might affect various ethnic groups in Scotland.
Now, you had concerns prior to the pandemic hitting the UK from observations that you could see of what was happening, for example, in Italy and Spain, possibly also China, but in Europe, Italy and Spain. You made certain, or took certain views as to the vulnerable communities that the pandemic was likely to affect in Britain and in particular in Scotland. Can you tell me how you were able to make those assumptions, well, indeed, what those assumptions were and how you were able to make them? Yeah,
BEMIS by that stage had 20 years' experience of working with ethnic minority communities within Scotland, issues which pertain to them, which pre-existed the pandemic, around about overcrowding in housing, lower paid occupations, poverty, disproportionality living in poverty, effects of hate crime, issues like that. They just continued into the pandemic. It was when we saw the city of Wuhan of 20 million people being put into a full lockdown, I think, is when our consciousness initially went, okay, this is particularly unusual and unprecedented in our era. And as it travelled closer to the UK, but very particularly when we saw the impacts in Italy, that there was a mortality risk in relation to pre-existing health issues, elderly populations, transmission of the virus in high-density population, because of our pre-existing 20 years of knowledge of the different experiences of ethnic minority communities in Scotland. We knew there was a significant vulnerability to them with regards to those being the core concerns around about vulnerability to all of the things which occurred during the pandemic.
You mentioned in particular communities living in high-density accommodation and circumstances. Also, those who are in socioeconomic deprived communities. I think it's not asking an inopportune question, but were there particular communities in Scotland that you felt fell into that category at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah, Pakistani communities, various African communities, Polish communities, then smaller pockets, that don't appear in official statistics, but we know because we've worked with them over a considerable period of time, like the Nepalese community in Aberdeen. And all of these different developments of communities relate to migration patterns to Scotland over various different points, even in fairly recent history, with A2 and A8 secession into the EU, and different groups of people arriving here and clustering around different areas of employment. If you take the African community as an example, between the 2001 census and the 2011 census, which was the last census we had prior to the pandemic, that particular community had increased from around about 5,000 to around about 35,000. I mean, you have significant clusters, particularly in the north side of Glasgow, which is an area which scores high in the SIMD index of multiple deprivation. Pakistani community, this illustrates the complexity of the situation at hand. The Pakistani community is a multi-generational community. It's been here a significantly longer period of time, but due to various different circumstances continues to reside disproportionately also in areas of multiple deprivation. They have larger families, and they have multiple occupancy households between families. So all the Polish community, I think, we illustrated within our written testimony. Cluster of employment, which created significant risks, such as the Two Sisters chicken factory example, which we gave them 5. And again, clustered in higher density living environments. For the Polish community, a significant issue of single males coming over to work and sending money back to Poland, as illustrated via the movement of people due to new EU arrivals. So because of all of this pre-existed the pandemic, and then when the dynamics existed, which we saw dangers of transmission, it was very apparent to us that we were going to have some serious challenges on our hands.
Yes. Can I take you now to the end of the pandemic period that we are looking at in this inquiry, which is the end of 2022? The concerns that you had at the outset of the pandemic, were they realised, if I can put it that way, as the pandemic progressed?
Yes, they were. Yeah.
And did that come as a surprise to you?
It didn't come as a surprise to us, no.
Okay. And, well, it may be obvious, why didn't it come as a surprise to you?
Because we were very quickly able to establish, due to the examples I've given about the health, social, housing dynamics which were occurring in other European nations. When you apply those into Scotland specifically, you're going to have similar outcomes. We had a strong evidence base and knowledge of social inequalities which affected these communities, which would subsequently be significantly exacerbated by what the pandemic brought.
Can I ask you about the interaction that you had with the Scottish Government in particular at the outset of the pandemic? You make reference to 2 organisations. One, the acronym here. One is the ERG and the other is the EMNRN. Not the easiest to say, but hopefully we know what they are. Can you tell us about those two groups and BEMIS's involvement with those 2 groups, please?
So, as I said, when we were assessing the significant risks which were occurring around about late February, early March 2020, We knew that there was going to be significant issues which we'd have to deal with. So we set up what was called the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network, the goals of which are outlined in the statement, but essentially what myself and my colleagues, our Chief Executive Rami Usta, our Director of National Development Tanvir, again, who have been working in this environment for 20 years and developed, really strong relationships with not just our networks and members, but other collegial organisations across Scotland. We contacted them. We contacted them via email, via formal written letters, via phone calls, via WhatsApps. We shared with them our analysis, largely reflecting what I've just told you about our concerns about applying what's happened in Italy and other jurisdictions to Scotland, given the pre-existing concerns. These community organisations and regional equality hubs like CESREC and GREC are the ones who help generate that understanding. They live the disproportionalities on a day-to-day basis. So there was a really solid recognition that we better come together here and look to collaborate in order to address the health and social and cultural and economic issues which are about to unfold. So the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network was established by BEMIS and collegial organisations across Scotland to respond to those issues within our communities.
And when was that established?
March 2020.
Right. So very early in the pandemic.
Yeah, rapidly. Yeah, very early on.
Mm-hmm. And what was the involvement of the Scottish Government and their reaction to that organisation?
Our initial experience with officials in the Scottish Government in that particular time was excellent, was very good. They recognised and understood what we were telling them were going to be significant concerns, and attended meetings, supported what we were doing, provided financial support to respond to some of the core issues of, for example, increased destitution, which we were identifying. The expert reference group was the group set up by the Scottish Government, yes. Not by the community sector. And the expert reference group was primarily made up of academics, although there was supposed communities representation from BEMIS, who were invited to join the group. I think after it initially had met and been established, and we had picked up via the press or whatever it was that had been established, and then had asked Scottish ministers, we've set up this resilience network which has a significant representation from across Scotland, broad representation under the terms of the Equalities Act, which is obviously going to be incredibly important in terms of the provision of services during a pandemic. At which point we were invited to join that group, but we didn't join that group until the second meeting.
Mm-hmm. And I think you go on to indicate that there were some difficulties in relation to definitions, which we'll come to, but I think you've already hinted about that. So far as the early part of the pandemic is concerned, I think you say in paragraph 22 of your statement that as a result of the regular contacts that you were having with your feeder organisations, if I can call them that, it became apparent that there was a need for immediate financial assistance. Can you explain how that came about and what was done about that?
Yeah, it was a bit of a perfect storm. Again, there's a disproportionality of ethnic minority communities working in precarious employment, self-employed, taxi drivers, small business holders, delivery drivers, for example. And we also had the other things which I've talked about: disproportionate high density living in clusters, multiple family occupancies, and then the impact of the reserved immigration designation and no recourse to public funds. So we were aware of people who, so again, this is prior to full lockdown when everybody was told to stay at home, but we were aware of people who would not be able to get furloughed, contracted status, so not people with no contracts or zero-hour contracts who were just, left. And the immigration designation and no recourse to public funds would mean that they can't apply for universal credit. So we were aware that there was an extreme risk of people literally running out of money within days, weeks maybe, with large families and huge responsibilities. So that was a massive worry.
These were people in communities that had, use the expression, fallen through the cracks.
People who, even in the best circumstances pre-pandemic, already have extremely difficult lives, who are now, things are going to get significantly more extreme.
There's no safety net for them in the pandemic. Would that be correct?
Sorry, can you
There
repeat
was
that?
no safety net for them in the pandemic.
There was no safety net.
You do tell us that these people who would not have had access to finance between April and June 2020, this is in paragraph 22 of your statement, BEMIS distributed over £36,000 to 247 referrals to support around 700 individuals.
That's correct.
Now, can I just ask, because I asked you earlier about your role as in BEMIS as a strategic organisation. This is you turning into a service provider.
We saw no other option at that time. You've identified that there was no safety net. We tried to, we tried to weave as best a safety net as we possibly could for as many people as we possibly could. It's again ironic. We're discussing previously about pre-pandemic planning. In 2016, we had flagged up the significant issue and continued to advocate around about the real risk of no recourse to public funds and the ability potentially for the Scottish Government to integrate payments to children affected by their parents' immigration designation using social security powers, which had come from the Smith Commission around about that time. And that concern had then, significantly been exacerbated by the impacts of the pandemic. Yes, so we turned for that period of time basically administering a social security payment to people who otherwise would have no access to financial support.
Yeah, and that wasn't your that wasn't the areas in which you or your staff were familiar with dealing.
That wouldn't be something. I mean, we have had significant experience of distributing small grants funding to organisations for policy engagement or particular things which we're doing. We have experience in that, but typically, no, we do not sit and read the types of referrals which we were receiving in order to provide emergency payments to people for the reasons we've outlined.
Can I just ask, your staff, without that previous experience, what effect did that have on them, reading about people in dire circumstances?
It was extremely difficult. It certainly took a toll on people's mental health, I think. I think all of us experienced a sort of adrenaline rush leading into, and at that initial stage of lockdown, there was a significant amount of goodwill and, that we're all in pulling here together to try and do our best. So people stepped up to do that job without giving it a second thought. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight now, looking back at it, I think it did take a significant toll on both administratively because of the volume of applications, but also, the reality of what you're...
Essentially, you and your staff were being told of tragic circumstances. By that, I don't mean necessarily death, but very difficult circumstances, particularly involving children.
Correct.
You've told us, as I've said, that between April and June 2020, BEMIS distributed about just over £36,000. And I assume that's also what you refer to in paragraph 24 where you say that that was an emergency sustenance fund. You also say at the bottom of, I think it's paragraph 27, that it was hugely oversubscribed. Did that result in you having to reduce the amounts that were paid out to people, or did it mean that some people didn't get anything?
It meant that we had to close the referral system while there was a high volume of referrals still coming in, because we knew we still had X amount to read through, and we knew from what was left that it would go fairly rapidly. We did write to the Scottish Government to advise them that that particular fund would need to be extended for a period of time. We didn't think we had the capacity to provide that service long term, and that became a recommendation which the expert reference group eventually endorsed. But I think our hope would have been that we could have extended that from June to probably August, September. However, there was if memory serves me correctly, I don't think we even received a reply to that particular letter.
Right. Just to be clear, the £36,000, where did that funding come from?
From the Scottish Government and from BEMIS, BEMIS's own reserves.
You do make reference to other funding that you were involved in the distribution of. This is paragraph 24 and following in your statement. Can you just tell us a little bit about that additional funding, what that was used for?
Yeah. So we had the Emergency Sustenance Fund, which we've talked about. The other issue we identified and spoke to the Scottish Government around about that time was what became known as the Transition Fund. The Transition Fund was to help community organisations move their services and engagement online, and to respond to the challenges of lockdown. We had the Mental Health and Vaccination Fund. We had Tackling Isolation and Loneliness, Vaccine Information Fund, Resilient and Inclusive Communities, and again an Emergency Sustenance Fund, which was provided due to the impacts of Omicron and the rapid need to go back into a lockdown at that period. So, you know, over the duration of that March 2020 to December 2022 period, there was 8 different funds which were provided to respond to specific social or health issues which we had identified had required intervention. The vast majority of that funding, around about 250,000, came from the Scottish Government, stretched over those funds in different time periods of those 2 years, and the other part came from around about 67,000 came from Foundation Scotland, who are an independent grant provider.
How adequate was that funding overall?
Inadequate. I think it was helpful. We were able to do the best we possibly could with it, but there was always a need for more.
I'll just ask you something about two particular aspects of funding. One is what you refer to in paragraph 30 of your statement, which is transition funding of £50,000 to assist communities experiencing digital isolation. Now, we've heard a great deal throughout this inquiry of the impact on certain communities and certain individuals of digital isolation, digital exclusion. Was this a particular issue in relation to the communities that you represent?
Yep. Yes, digital exclusion is a characteristic of contemporary poverty in Scotland. Not everybody has Wi-Fi, not everybody has tablets and phones and all sorts of things like that. So again, when lockdown exacerbated pre-existing inequalities significantly, so we've, you know, as children transition to learning from educated from home, not everybody had access to the infrastructure required to continue to participate in society as they had done before lockdown.
Right. In paragraph 31, you also mention funding from the Scottish Government for mental health and translation services. And I think you then go on to refer to the British Association of Counselling Practitioners.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that arrangement? What was that directed to addressing?
Yeah, so like the general population, there was a massive increase in mental health concerns as a consequence of lockdown, but very specific to the groups which we work with, having different variations of expertise or proficiency within English. It was identified that we required professional counsellors be ACP registered but who are bilingual or multilingual in order to provide that service, which the state necessarily didn't have the capacity to do so. The state could, and as an example, provide that service with a translator, but what we were being told by members was that to have that sort of service provision using translation services, the dynamic didn't particularly work very well. So we set up mental health support using professional counsellors who were bilingual. Rich languages such as Arabic are not that easily, particularly when it's very personal things you're talking about, are not particularly easily translated into English. You really need someone who's proficient in those particular languages to understand the essence of what somebody's articulating to you. And that was information that was fed back by these communities to us, and then our staff using their you remember our staff come from ethnic minority communities too. So for example, our chief executive is fluent Arabic speaker, our director of national development is fluent Punjabi and Urdu. They understand what has been told to them in that particular environment, and were able subsequently to set up this counselling services. Again, similar to the Emergency Sustenance Fund, took direct referrals from community organisations and sometimes from duty bearers like social workers, because this was an expert service provision which was provided at an extremely challenging time and was hugely necessary.
Perhaps useful if I can just tie a few things together there, and other things that you mentioned in your statement about the availability of translations. You do tell us later, and we'll come to it in a few moments, about some of the difficulties around vaccination, the rollout of the vaccination programme. And you do tell us about the need for translation of documents for full vaccine understanding. And you also tell us about the guidance that BEMIS received from government, which either you passed on, but you yourself didn't pass on. You didn't create guidance, you just passed on guidance, I think. Is that? Were there any particular difficulties regarding translation of any of these documents, or in whatever particular area that we were talking about? Did you find that there were any difficulties with that? Yeah,
that was a relentless challenge across, whether it was test and protect, whether it was vaccination, whether it was isolation support. These were relentless challenges, and we sort of had to. I think what did happen was the government would provide it, and then we'd retrospectively have to work with the communities to identify the interventions required for that information to become accessible to them. From memory, issues which arose, which even sometimes the particular language, like Punjabi, it was a much higher level of Punjabi than necessarily was spoken within the communities. We had to address that. Other issues which were identified were around about as a way to make the information more visual, and the use of images in order to portray information. So this was the issue of communication of critical information across a whole plethora of issues during the pandemic was just something we dealt with continuously. Usually what happened as a as a consequence of that is that eventually, after a particular period of time, we'd end up with a bank of resources translated into multiple languages, identified by diverse communities as what they needed. But it didn't happen. It almost always happened retrospectively rather than built into the system.
Again, looking forward to the possibility of another pandemic. Would a central hub, as it were, where translations could be carried out, have been an assistance rather than having to be done on the basis that you've indicated?
Very much so, and that sort of service provision essentially boils down to the state understanding the demographics it's required to serve at any particular time. You know, our demographics changed from 2001 to 2011, and then from 2011 to 2022. So I think that's why I also return to this issue of the application of the definition of race as it applies within the Equality Act and the evolution of public services. That the state should continuously be trying to understand the demographics it's attempting to serve. And, you know, in this, the example of translation is one such example.
Thank you. Could we go back to the expert reference group? One of the things you say about the expert reference group was the need to have a consensus within that group. And I think you indicate that there wasn't that consensus. First of all, what was your role within that group? What were you doing?
So when I attended the meetings, I deputised for our Chief Executive, Rami Usta, and our role was to bring the evidence which we had developed from the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network, which was occurring in real time, and ensure that that was heard and engaged with at the expert reference groups. The expert reference groups' agendas would reflect, you know, maybe what was happening at any particular time. You know, what's the health risks, what's the mortality risks, what's the, you know, essentially generally what's happening in terms of ethnic minority communities' experiences in Scotland in relation to the pandemic.
What you say, I think it's at paragraph 47, is that your experience of the ERG was not always positive.
No.
And an example you give, and you give some detail about this, is the issue of COVID-19 mortality rates in June 2020. Now, we could see what you read there. Can you just briefly explain what that difficulty was?
Yeah, when we attended our Chief Executive attended the first meeting of our first participation within the expert reference group, we had requested, we didn't think it would be particularly challenging or controversial, but in order because there's a wide variation of academics involved within the group, as well as BEMIS, that we should, you know, have an agreed, and we're informing public services about service provision during the pandemic, that we should include a definition of ethnicity aligned to legal obligations within the group's terms of reference, because this is the expert reference group on COVID and ethnicity. That wasn't agreed. That there was pushback on having the legal definition of race contained within the terms of reference. We found that to be problematic, because what we foresaw was that there would then be various different interpretations of prioritisation of impacts of the pandemic, which would then feed into service provision and could possibly exacerbate inequalities and concerns for specific ethnic groups.
Can you, well, you do tell us about this in more detail in your statement, but so far as certain communities were concerned, what were the difficulties as a result of this approach that was being taken in the ERG?
So BEMIS, the problem is if you take an Equalities and Human Rights approach to recognising the various ethnic challenges affecting people in Scotland on those provisions of colour, nationality, ethnic or national origin, you're pulling in a significant group of people. So you have multi-generational ethnic minority communities in Scotland, Pakistani, Jewish, Irish, Polish, Indian, and various others. You have newer migrant populations as a linked to the EU nations. So you have much more Eastern European, Roma, Polish, and then a massive increase in the African community, which is incredibly diverse. So if you want to interrogate experiences which they are simultaneously having, then you take a broad approach to it, which is a legal obligation approach. If you don't want to take that approach, the other option is to prioritise one of the provisions. In this case, the tension was between, do we take all of the provisions simultaneously, or do we just focus or prioritise colour? And that was the tension within the expert reference group. BEMIS were pushing for a full recognition of the entire legal definition, whereas specific other academics were maybe focused on their own academic backgrounds and experiences, which is absolutely fine. That was their expertise to bring to the table, but that was dominated by the provision of colour in communities who are easily would fall under that or be identifiable under that, which for us wasn't sufficient because Scotland's ethnic diversity is significantly broader than that. And this was not a time for a sociological debate. This was the state and us responding to the real day-to-day experiences of communities on the ground. Now, sorry, just to finish off on one aspect of that, there's no problem with disagreement on an expert reference group. That may occur, and that then it's incumbent upon the duty bearer, who is the Scottish Government at this particular point, to balance all of this evidence up and say, right, in this area we'll pursue A, B, C and D. The Scottish Government sat back. They provided secretariat, but they provided no leadership on that particular group, and sort of sat back and allowed this competitive environment to manifest, which then led to variations and recommendations which to one degree or another have been pursued over the intervening period. But I'm very comfortable to say that my experience and BEMIS experience was that the actual lived experience day to day of ethnic minority communities and the variations of experiences that was affecting them was not front and centre of the expert reference group's thinking or subsequent recommendations which government chose to pursue.
I think you've certainly put it fairly bluntly and perhaps pithily that in the expert reference group, these sort of discussions should have been left at the door, and the exigencies of the situation should have taken priority to arrive at a more disaggregated assessment of the impacts of the pandemic. Would I be right in that?
You would be right, that'd be correct, because any disproportionality in any of these provisions would eventually was shown up in all of the anecdotal evidence that we were developing as part of the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network, and over time will eventually show up within the disaggregation of data, which is something the state continues to try to develop and evolve to prepare for any manner of policy outcomes and interventions. But yes, there should have been no confusion over who we had obligations to, how those obligations were codified into law, how those codifications in law could potentially affect the provision of public services, and that's what our obligations as a collective was, and that's not what occurred. Not putting the Equalities Act definition and the International Convention definition into the terms of reference is a symptom of a dysfunction within the group, which then became structural and continued throughout. and that is an issue of significant regret, that occurred the way that occurred.
And I think you've explained to us, to a certain extent in your statement, but in other documents that you produced, that's been an ongoing difficulty.
Well, one of the core recommendations which came from the expert reference group was recommendation 7.
Yes.
I've provided a significant amount of written, verbal evidence of the issues which affected the diversity of ethnic minority communities protected under law in Scotland, which were there prior to the pandemic and which were exacerbated during the pandemic. And it was really incumbent upon us to ensure that any recommendations and progress that was made reflected what they experienced. Recommendation 7 is the cornerstone community's recommendation about setting up a national infrastructure to address the pre-existing problems, to address what occurred during the pandemic, and to forecast into the future to help create a fairer and better Scotland to ensure these problems don't occur again. And recommendation 7 of the expert reference group was broadly drafted to align with the International Convention, to align with the historical and contemporary and potential future experiences of this wide range of ethnic minority communities who live in Scotland and who were affected by the pandemic. But in the progression and implementation of recommendation 7, the Scottish Government made an arbitrary decision with no consultation to restrict progression of that to colour only, and have been explicit about that in their terms of reference of, apologies for more acronyms, of the groups which subsequently took on the legacy of recommendation 7, which was initially, because of the time frame of what's been considered by the inquiry, was the Anti-Racism and Governance Group, which progressed this work, focused on colour only, racialised some minority ethnic communities like Polish, Irish, Jewish, Scottish Gypsy Traveller as white, in contradiction to their rights and how they describe themselves, and in contradiction to the evidence developed during the pandemic. So the legacy presently, the significant legacy from a community's perspective of what government has progressed as a consequence of their experience during the pandemic is to develop a whole new infrastructure which is going to reinforce that exclusion.
Can I finally look with you at a section of your statement in relation to vaccination? So you've provided us with quite a lot of information there. You do indicate that there was assistance in relation to the vaccination. I think you mentioned the involvement of Jason Leach, the National Clinical Director. And I think you as an organisation also organised representatives of Cambridge AstraZeneca to give information to either to you or to the communities. Was that all helpful?
Yeah. So just yes, it was helpful. None of this stuff sort of just like dropped out the sky. Because the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network had been, by this stage, had developed a significant amount of credibility as an engagement tool and evidence source. It was routine at this stage in October, December 2020, as we led into the first vaccination implementation, that senior officials would attend our meetings. For example, in October, we had senior officials from Public Health Scotland, Senior Health Improvement Officer. In December 2020, COVID vaccine policy team leader, the organisational lead for screening and immunisation at Public Health Scotland. So, this helped identify at an early stage what some of the issues around about vaccination would look like, and I can provide you further information on that if required. The engagement of, it was the Oxford AstraZeneca team, I think,
Sorry, Oxford, yes. Not
yeah,
Cambridge, sorry, my apologies.
came, as I remember, around about March, April 2021, and it was they offered to come, and that was partly useful for us because of it was very useful because of the pre-identified issues which we had developed from engaging with the communities in October, December, via a survey which was taken of Resilience Network members, and what had manifested within the context of those discussions, which eventually led to the policy intervention we advocated for and implemented, and what we articulated to the Scottish Government and particular duty bearers around about vaccinations.
You've mentioned a number of communities where there was certain difficulties in the take-up of the vaccination, the Polish community because of certain religious beliefs, the African, Caribbean, black communities, concern about the use of the members of those communities in trials that have taken place, the Gypsy and traveller communities that were hard to reach. Did these difficulties reflect, or were they reflected in information that came out about the take-up of the vaccine?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm not quite certain.
The difficulties regarding the take-up of the vaccine in certain communities that I've mentioned, when information eventually came out about the overall take-up of the vaccine, were these individual community difficulties reflected in those figures? No.
And this is part of the problem with regards to having various interpretations of obligations relating to the protected characteristic of race in the provision of public services. We might have an agreement, for example, the examples you've identified around about the variations of experiences and hesitancy. There might be a recognition that that's an experience, but when it came to providing us the evidence to say who has taken the vaccine, all of that was lost because everything was aggregated up into racial classifications like white, black, Asian, other, which they're not ethnicities. They're groups of ethnic groups which are put into a racial block, which actually for the provision of public services generally, but certainly during a pandemic and a national health emergency, it wasn't helpful because you need the disaggregation on the groups in order to have a much clearer picture of what's going on.
Well, you've explained that very clearly in your statement. Just finish with a couple of points in this. You did set up BEMIS. Did set up a vaccine information fund. What was the purpose of that?
So from the issues which were identified by the communities around about not being tested on a diverse population, different vaccines being used, concerns around if I get a vaccine, will I be deported? All of this, if I don't get the vaccine, will I be deported? All of this, all of these multitude of concerns emanating from different ethnic groups. In order to address all of that, what became very, very clear from the communities themselves that they wanted to have direct access and safer places to have these conversations in a place which was relevant to them, using different languages, using different visual aids. And they wanted different people there. Some of them wanted Scottish Government officials working in vaccination and health. Some of them wanted the Oxford AstraZeneca people. Some of them wanted to identify, other international experts who would attend. But our policy response to that, after hearing all of this, was to advocate to government that we need to set up a vaccine information fund to empower these communities to have these conversations as they see fit. And that's what the Vaccine Information Fund was. It was financial support for communities to set up and address all of this multitude of questions pertaining to their number one priorities in a way which was relevant and beneficial to them.
There's an expression that you use, and I'll finish with this if I may. You do refer to informed consent in relation to vaccination. Now, those of us who are familiar with, there's a case called Montgomery, which was in the Supreme Court a number of years ago in the context of medical negligence of informed consent. Can you just indicate what you see as the need for informed consent in the vaccine context?
Yeah, we didn't see our role as telling people they had to get the vaccination or obligating them to get the vaccination. Informed consent, from our perspective, could work. It could be to consent or not consent. It was to have informed conversations in a way which was relevant to them in order to increase understanding of what they were being asked to do.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Boyle, you've given the inquiry a number of suggestions at the end of your statement of various possible recommendations and lessons that should be learned. A lot of them, obviously, we've read them. We can understand them. Some, I think, you'll appreciate, are probably beyond the remit of this inquiry. However, I suppose it's rather like asking which is your favourite child. Do you have a particular lesson that you would like us to take away from your experience in BEMIS?
Yes, very much so. I think there's a number of recommendations there. It was incumbent upon us to include a recommendation around about a formal apology from the Scottish Government for excluding communities from critical policy decisions which affected them and re-traumatising them to a certain extent by ignoring what experiences they had during the pandemic, and that's most obvious within the progression of Recommendation 7, which is strategic excluded many. We appreciate that apology will probably not be forthcoming, but nonetheless, like we've had to do throughout the pandemic, is raise awareness of what affected our membership and what affected our stakeholders and networks, and articulate that without fear or favour. So I highlight that. However, things which are more likely to be progressed and are incredibly important, there's three which are interlinked: 108, 110 and 112. Avoid competitive recognition between communities. What we've seen at the moment during the pandemic, and has got worse in the post-pandemic during an economic crisis, is that those provisions of colour, nationality, ethnic or national origin are presently in the implementation of policy, and this will occur again if we continue down this path, if there was a pandemic next week, is that those communities are having to compete against each other for their voices to be heard by Scottish Government and for their voices and rights to be progressed. That has to be addressed and changed in full compliance and recognition with their legal rights. It has to be central to that. 110, recognise and resource the ethnic minority third sector.
Yes. They
stepped up to the plate, did an incredible job. I'd like to pay tribute to my colleagues in the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network who worked diligently, consistently to support each other and also support communities, and have since suffered significant real terms budget cuts. And finally, support for the Anti-Racism Observatory, which is happening, and it's linked to the two previous recommendations I've made. An Anti-Racism Observatory, which has progressed in Scotland as a policy legacy of the pandemic, must recognise all of the communities in Scotland who experienced disproportionate impacts during the pandemic. And if this is to be the cornerstone for Scottish Government's development of policy, be it in relation to anti-racism or race equality, or in any pre-pandemic planning which may come in the future, or for any social issue which we must face, then it's not acceptable for government to develop and support institutions which don't recognise the reality of what people experienced or what their legal rights are in Scotland, and they must absolutely avoid creating circumstances where communities must compete against each other for their rights to be heard.
Mr. Boyle, those are all the questions I have for you, unless His Lordship has any matters he'd like to ask about. But from my perspective, thank you very much for your attendance and your information you've given us.
No, indeed. Thank you, Mr. Boyle. That's all.
Thank you. 11:15 then.
All rise.
No. Good morning, Mr. Turner.
Good morning, my lord. My lord, the next session is a panel of witnesses, three of whom are in the room and one who has just joined us on screen.
Oh, yes.
They are representatives of regional equality councils, and they are Dr. Iman Hani from the Central Scotland Regional Equality Council, Mr. Ross Mackay, who's on screen, from Grampian Regional Equality Council, Mr. Elric Honoré from Fife Centre for Equalities, and Mr. Anil Singh Bhopal from West of Scotland Regional Equality Council.
Oh, very good. Good morning to you all.
Morning.
Now, when you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Lord. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. A brief reminder, if I can start by saying today's hearing will be transcribed. If we could try and speak slowly and clearly and not speak over each other, that will help our stenographers greatly. I'm going to come to each of you first of all and just ask if you could tell us your full name and your current role, and if any different, what your role was during the pandemic. Dr. Hani, if I could come to you first.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Iman Hani. I am the Co-Chief Executive Officer of the Central Scotland Regional Equality Council, or CESREC for short. My role during the pandemic was one of the project coordinators at the organisation.
Thank you. And Mr. Honoré?
Hi there, good morning. So my full name is Vivian Elric Honoré. I use my second name Elric, which is a bit more easy to use. I'm Chief Exec at Fife Centre for Equalities. At the time, I was Development Officer within the team.
Thank you. And Mr. Bhopal?
Yeah, my name is Anil Singh Bhopal. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the West of Scotland Regional Equality Council, more commonly referred to as WESREC. During the pandemic, I was a Development Officer for the organisation, where I worked part-time alongside a role with the Scottish Refugee Council, where I was working as a Regional Coordinator for the South West of Scotland.
Thank you. And Mr. Mackay?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Ross Allen Mackay. I'm currently the General Manager at Grampian Regional Equality Council, usually known as GREC. And at the time, I would have been coordinating our casework projects.
Thank you. Each of you has given a statement to the inquiry. And for reference, my lord, Dr. Hani's statement is SCI WT 0515 number 1. Mr. Mackay's is SCI WT 06171. Mr. Honoré's is SCI WT 08241. And Mr. Bhopal's statement is SCI WT 00971. Mr. Bhopal, this is your second occasion giving evidence to the inquiry. You gave evidence previously on the 17th of December 2024, is that correct?
Yeah.
Thank you. And you also attended a round table meeting, the report of which is SCI WT 02051, my lord, and that took place on the 28th of June 2024, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. By way of introduction to our theme today, I wonder if I could ask each of you just to give a brief introduction to your organisation and really just tell His Lordship a little bit about perhaps the history of that organisation and its role, if I may. Dr. Hani, again, if I could start with you.
Sure. So, Central Scotland Regional Equality Council is a race equality and a human rights organisation. It was established 41 years ago when the central government, the local authority was called Central Scotland, which covers right now the three local authorities of Stirling, Clackmannanshire and Falkirk. We continue to serve the communities, mainly the racialised communities, ethnic minorities in those three local authorities. but we're not restricted to them. It's just our main area of benefit on any issues that link to human rights, racial discrimination, or lack of inequality.
Thank you. And could I ask you just a couple of questions? Who operates the organisation?
So we are a registered Scottish charity, and we are also a company limited by guarantee, which means we have a board of directors that are responsible for the operations of the organisation, or the overseeing of the operations of the organisation. The day-to-day responsibilities lie within the senior management team, which is myself and my colleague, because we are on a shared role with the chief executive post.
And other than the staff, do you have other volunteers that work with you?
Not at the moment. We did before COVID.
Could you tell us about the volunteers before COVID?
So we had about 40 plus volunteers. CESRIC had multiple projects that we ran for the communities, being a charity. Everything we offer is free for the beneficiaries. And of course, we relied on a lot on the kindness and the generosity and the experiences of the volunteers that come from various backgrounds. During COVID, things have changed massively, and we've lost all of our volunteers, and that basically meant that we are the only volunteers that are registered with us at the moment are our board of trustees.
Was there any particular reason that you lost your volunteers, do you know?
Well, a variety of reasons. Mainly, to start with, was the nature of the pandemic and the lockdown, and the fact that most of our functions were put to halt until we figured out a way. But also people's priorities. Sometimes, their personal experiences, the volunteers' personal experiences during the lockdown, and what that meant for them, and the impact that it had personally on them. And then priorities in terms of the socioeconomic status, where people really needed to secure other forms of income to support their families and themselves, of course. And of course, volunteering did not support that, because as a volunteer, you're only paid your expenses, but not really any sufficient amounts of money to keep you going.
Thank you. Mr. Mackay, could I come to you next? Could you tell us about Grampian?
Sure. So GREC are a registered charity based in Aberdeen, and our sort of mission is to lead the way in advancing equality across the northeast of Scotland. So we work in Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and Moray. We look to tackle prejudice and discrimination, celebrate diversity, build positive community relations, and provide evidence to change policy and practice. We support anyone with a protected characteristic, but the majority of people who access our services would be in relation to race and ethnicity.
And again, Mr. Mackay, who on a day-to-day basis operates GREC?
Yeah, so similar to CESRIC, we have a board and a senior management team who deal with the day-to-day things. So at the moment, that's myself as the general manager, but has recently included my colleague.
Thank you. And Mr. Honoré, could you tell us about Fife Centre for Equalities?
Yes, for sure. So, including the name, we operate in Fife. We are similarly set up, so it is a company's house-registered company alongside with a charity with Oscar. We have a team which is basically, we're led by our board of trustees, and basically we have a team where we are more or less working part-time these days, and we focus on equality and diversity in the Fife region. That means a lot of things, but a lot of our work is across all protected characteristics. So we don't mainly focus on race, but a lot of our clients, similar to what Ross just said, is related to race, minority, ethnic groups. We work a lot with disability and across all protected characteristics in general. As to what our main clientele was during COVID, it was quite similar. It was also people from minority ethnic groups, a lot of people with disability.
Thank you. And again, is your organisation, who operationally runs your organisation?
Operationally, so obviously I work as a chief executive. We have a team of officers. who more or less focus on specific areas of work for the organization. We've split it in operational and corporate work, so the behind the scenes and out there in engagement mode. And we do have assistants that actually directly do a lot of the engagement, communication, the calls with clients, seeing people in the community, in outreach, and we also have volunteers who assist with that.
Thank you. My Lord, I'm just confirming whether we may have a breach.
There'll be a short delay.
That's been addressed, my Lord. Mr. Honorary, I think you managed to finish your answer before we stopped there. Did you have anything else to add before I move to Mr. Bhopal?
I think that's more or less it.
Thank you. Mr. Bhopal, you'll be relieved to hear that I'm not going to ask you to repeat the answer you gave when you were asked this question in December. His Lordship has obviously heard about WESREC and the fact that it covers 12 local authority areas. I wonder if you could, however, tell us a bit about the ordinary sort of casework, the ordinary work that WESREC does before the pandemic, just so we have an idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, very similar to CESREC and GREC and also LREC, who are based in the Edinburgh and Lothians region. We cover a number of different projects that vary in terms of theme, focusing on employability, heritage, community development, casework, which supports people with their housing queries, work to do with employment, and also advice service on support for victims of hate crime, discrimination and racism. We also used to run a fairly prominent EDI and anti-racism training and consultancy service, which kept us busy in terms of delivering training and support to other organisations across the public and private sectors. So very varied work that differs across each project strand, and thankfully post-pandemic not too much of that has changed.
And in terms of the mechanics of that, how would that work ordinarily have been done?
So really, you know, we have had an SMT of around 3 people for the past decade or so. So that covers our CEO, our deputy director, and a head of HR and finance as well. We oversee project managers who lead that project work and have their own staff teams and volunteers that support that. And that's just how we've operated for a number of years. In terms of securing money for the project, like many charities across the third sector, we regularly have to go for different funding bids. The vast majority of our money comes from the Scottish Government, but we use other sources. At the moment, for example, we're funded through Historic Environment Scotland, through the National Lottery Communities Fund and the Robertson Trust. So a lot of our work focuses on trying to secure that funding to sustain ourselves as an organisation.
And in terms of the casework, would that have taken place face-to-face? Do you have an office that people would come and see you at? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we do the odd bit of outreach work in terms of going out to the communities to engage with them directly, but the vast majority of people used to come into our office in Napier's Hall Street in the West End of Glasgow, and now do so in our new offices, which is situated in Ruckhill in Glasgow also.
Thank you. Dr. Hani, could you tell us how would you have undertaken, or how would the organisation have undertaken work again before the pandemic?
So majority of the work, of course, we had, again, similar to the other organisations and the representatives in the room today, we had several projects running, but our bulk was the support and advice service, which is basically the casework support. That was a one-to-one support that's given to individuals on a variety of issues, including issues with housing, with employment, with trouble accessing services, any barriers basically that they are facing. And more recently in immigration services, we are a regulated body that offers level 1 advice at level 1. That was not the case, obviously, during the pandemic. It was something that came after, and we've developed to address because of the rise in the demand in the areas that we cover. But prior to COVID and during the pandemic, it was the projects, and it was a mix of the one-to-one support that we give to the communities, but also the outreach work, whether it being community events, whether it being a majority of that outreach was awareness raising and training and consultancy services. And that was offered to community groups, organizations, and to public bodies on a more regular basis. But of course, it sort of died down with all the changes that had happened during the pandemic and afterwards.
Thank you. Mr. Mackay, you mentioned in your statement a couple of projects that Greg were undertaking, a New Scots initiative and a language cafe. I wonder if you could tell His Lordship about those.
Yeah, no problem. So we were delivering some commission services to help with resettlement of Syrian communities in the city. We did a little bit in the Shire as well, but predominantly in Aberdeen City. As part of that, we delivered a drop-in session. So every Tuesday, myself and a couple of colleagues would be there along with an Arabic-speaking interpreter. And we would do one-to-one casework basically for Syrian families who'd been arriving in the city since 2016, 2017. And obviously that was one of the first things that we had to stop doing when the restrictions around the pandemic came in. It wasn't going to be appropriate or safe to have those meetings. We also run a language cafe. It's probably our biggest sort of public-facing regular event. So we would be meeting every Thursday somewhere in a city centre venue. At the time of the pandemic, we were meeting in a cinema in town. They had a sort of cafe space in their basement. We delivered a sort of like informal language learning, but also it was a very social event. And we would usually have at least sort of 40 people come into that. That was the capacity of that building at the time. It was never really possible to recover the Syrian drop-in service because the Home Office funding that would have paid for that had run out by the time it would have been safe to resume. But I'm happy to say that the language cafe rebounded well, and we meet in a bigger space now, and we have about 80 people a week come along to that. But certainly there was a long period where we couldn't deliver any of those things. The New Scots casework, to begin with, moved to phone calls and then eventually Zoom. And similarly, to try and mitigate for the absence of the language cafe, when it was possible to do so, we were having language walks in the sort of better weather. So the group would meet and we would go on sort of short guided walks. And again, it gave people some of the informal language practice and also the social part.
And was that well attended?
Yeah, the language walks are really well attended. Again, at that time we had a healthy turnout of about 40 people to a regular language cafe, and we were having similar numbers for the language walks. Probably a little bit less, but pretty similar.
Thank you, Mr. Honoré. Just to draw this section to a close, the other thing you mentioned in your statement was the Equalities Council acting as an intermediary.
Yeah, so we pre-COVID, we weren't really so much involved in service delivery. We would be more advising and training, and also acting as a responder to, say, hate crime as a third-party reporting center, or people would come and speak to us on equality concerns about specific issues. A lot of work that we would do would be mainly about organizing consultations or engagement around specific topics. It would, an engagement session about a specific disability or a specific issue like financial harm. and bring as many people as possible from multiple protected characteristics around themes. So it's kind of a service, but it's not truly a service. It is more intermediary. We work with colleagues, experts, and organize these events. Our main focus will be to make sure it is extremely inclusive, that a lot of people that are usually out of a communication loop for these events could take part. So that was really the bulk of our work, that makes sense. And so that means we would have drawn relationships there with people that had multiple barriers to attendance, and that was the mainstay of our work. I see that intermediary because we're linking between professionals, experts in, public safety or adult protection or public health and so on, with communities that we grow links with over a long period of time. So that's why I would say we're more intermediary as the advice and guidance. But COVID changed that a fair bit. We had to start intervening. I think we talked about that a bit later on. But so there was a bit of a change. We were set up in a different way, I think, because we're quite recent as an organization. We were set up in 2015, and the plan was always to work as a facilitator towards consultations and engagement to specific community groups.
Thank you. Mr. Bhopal, you mentioned engagement later on through arrangements that were made via BEMIS in particular. But pre-pandemic, what was your level of engagement with public authorities and the Scottish Government in particular?
Yeah, I mean, okay, not brilliant. It's probably improved over the last 5 years post-pandemic, but we had a relatively good relationship with key partners from the public sector, particularly Police Scotland and the NHS. They would often reach out to us for advice on how they can make material more accessible, how they can better engage with communities that are traditionally thought of as being hard to reach, such as those from a minority ethnic background. And as I mentioned earlier, we would also deliver training and consultancy services to members of those organisations and those similar to those organisations as well. So our working relationship was good. We didn't sit on as many expert advisory groups as we would have liked to, and that probably is still the case. We realise that there's representatives from other organisations working in the same sphere as us who do represent the communities that we serve and do that well, I believe. But the relationship generally was good. Perhaps not as good as what we would have liked it to be.
Dr. Haney, you were not asked, or you've told us in your statement, you were not asked about pre-pandemic planning before the event. Do you think that's something that would have assisted in terms of planning if organisations such as yourselves had been asked to input into the plans?
I believe it would have, yes. I always think I've said that before, and I will always say the same thing. When you speak to those who have got the knowledge and the expertise on the ground from the lived experiences of people who are directly impacted by anything, let alone a pandemic that hit the whole nation and the whole world, you get the answers. It's not through, with all the respect to all the academics and the researchers done, it's not through that you get the information. We have questioned the data and the collection of that. We have questioned so many things, not because we were not involved, because we don't believe that they were in touch with the reality of things. And we believe if the involvement had happened at an earlier stage with the right people across the country, things could have been prevented, could have been avoided, and the impact would have been a lot less.
I'd like to talk to you all now about the impact, if I may. We're in a hearing at the moment discussing equalities and human rights issues. Your groups obviously come across those every day. And I'd like His Lordship perhaps to hear some of those issues that you discussed. I wonder, Mr. Mackay, whether you could give His Lordship an indication of the kinds of issues that were arising in terms of some of the equalities matters.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the biggest barriers initially, though, was just being able to meet with people, especially where there was a digital barrier. So there was lots of devices available. There was funds to get devices to people, hardware, connectivity, but it was really challenging to work with people where they didn't have the digital skills or the experience of using those devices. So that was a big barrier to get round in the first instance, and obviously compounded for people where English might not have been their first language, or they weren't confident with speaking English. Even more so if there were difficulties around literacy, because you couldn't very well send people instructions to try and follow to join the Zoom meeting, or whatever. I suppose some of the other more specific things that came up, issues for some people with disabilities around either accessing the appropriate healthcare and support, or additional needs and support in education settings. We had a lot of people having difficulties around cultural practices following a death and not being able to grieve appropriately or follow up those sorts of things. We were involved quite a lot in disseminating information to communities, especially around vaccinations and things. So it was good that we had existing connections, particularly with NHS Grampian. So we were involved in that. We had a specific project around that sort of stuff, the Grampian Health and Diversity Network. So that part was quite good, but there are still challenges for communities who were finding it difficult to access information or reliable information about the rules and restrictions as they changed and evolved, or about the vaccine rollout as
you mentioned there, Mr. Mackay, they were struggling to access information. What was the reason that they were struggling to access information?
I suppose there was two main things. So one would have been just not being able to get information in their first language, or not knowing where to find the information in their first language. And I think the other one was about trust, or a lack of trust. So what we found was in some communities there was there's less trust around the information coming from government or recognised authorities. That was part of the objective of the Grampian Health and Diversity Network. So we had community connectors and health champions. So the community connectors were paid roles. Those were people who were well known in their communities. And then they recruited other people within the community to help with adapting messaging so that it was more accessible to communities, but also that it was then coming from trusted sources. And so that was to try and get past not just the language barrier, but also the accessibility of the messaging and any issues around trust of authority.
Thank you. Dr. Hani, picking up the point Mr. Mackay's made there about messaging and about communication, you mentioned in your statement that the issues were not just limited to questions of language, but also potentially cultural differences, and perhaps the Scottish culture as much as anything else. Could you expand upon that for us?
So with the particular experiences in the communication, is that what you mean? To start with, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. For someone who's not born and bred in the country, it's not always the first thing that you do to go and look into the government website, that, for example, or to know automatically where to find your information. So that in itself was a bit of a struggle. Again, the communities that we work across, the three local authorities that we work across and the communities that we work with come from a variety of backgrounds that are in some ways similar, but they are also vastly different from one another. And the fact that was not replicated in the communication that came from the Scottish Government did not help, because it felt like a one-size-fits-all sort of approach, which we fundamentally were against, because we know the struggles and the barriers just by the fact that we have the regular services that we offer, and knowing that we had to change certain ways of functioning to adapt to the communities that we deal with. And that knowledge in itself was helpful for us to know how to approach certain communities, how to speak to them, how to address particular issues and concerns that they would raise with us. The lack of the clarity in the communication, and even I think I'd mentioned it also in my statement, even when eventually the material was translated into languages, it was not that accessible. You could not find that information if you did not know how to type that in English to find it, which was pointless if you were talking to people who were not from this country, who wouldn't necessarily know that automatically if they weren't told how to do it. So that in itself was adding to the already existing barrier of communication and language.
Were those issues, you mentioned it got better, but were those issues, did they remain throughout the pandemic, or were they ultimately resolved at all?
Some of them had improved. So the hesitancy with the vaccination, for example, had improved after having several communications with both the NHS and the relevant communities to make them understand, again, the content of the vaccine, why is the vaccine important, how to, navigate all of the conspiracy theories around the vaccine that came about. And then for certain groups, like, for example, the asylum seekers and refugees, the fear of, if I don't take that on, it would impact my status in the country, it would impact my application. That alone needed addressing in a very different way to someone who's simply fearful of a needle prick. So again, understanding the reason why certain behaviours are happening from certain communities helps addressing those issues. I think in some of the communities, following the awareness sessions that were conducted across the country, not just in our area, and I believe my colleagues would agree on that, we have seen in certain communities an increase in the uptake in the vaccination. So some of these things have improved. The very fact that the NHS have responded by not only translating the material into various languages, but also actually acknowledging that they have not tested that, and later on making sure that they were accessible as they should be, also helped people find the information. It was a little bit late, but we can't say that it didn't improve. It did.
Thank you. Mr. Honoré, did you find in Fife or in your organisation communication issues that you're...
It's quite similar to my colleagues there. I think it's quite... So there was communication and it did improve. That's definitely the case. But the communication issues are quite present. The thing is, they were quite complex messages to start with. And they can be confusing. So once you have something which is confusing to start with, that needs to be translated. And when it's translated by multiple organizations, we would step in when it's required, and then there was translations available afterwards. But the information itself is complex to start with. That gets really difficult to work with at a local community level with specific relationships, because you need to, as Dr. Emma just said, you need to know the cultural understandings and possible reactions that people will have. And so I would say there that the communications were, they would have been better designed if they were simpler to start with, translated to give a standard and baseline that could then be improved and reinterpreted at local level with the relationships and understandings of multiple communities. It would have been way more effective to work in that way.
Do you have any view as to how that might best be done? So
it's not, because it was quite exceptional circumstances. So when the communications are, I would say, top down, so there is something that is coming from central government that is going down, funneled through workers, officers, community groups, hubs into the communities. It has to already have, I would say, the basics of a standard of translation with it at that time, because you can imagine the amount of double work that happens when this happens in all the hubs, again, all across the country. That time would have been much better invested by the workers there to actually phone people, contact them with already the basics of a communication that needs to happen and build on a relationship. But the problem that it created was because it was not centrally sourced, if that makes sense, there was issues of mistrust. Is this your interpretation of it? Who's done this? Who have interpreted it? Comes there? Is there mistakes there? So it introduces a lot of mistrust where there was none, or that one-off relationship. And it's not that local hubs would not have done over interpretations or additional translations, but it would have been based on a standard or a baseline where people would say, well, I can improve that a little bit by adding this because I know more about this community. I know what they're going to be afraid of. So I take the baseline and improve it a little bit. But that was not there. So it was very much, it improved over time. And it was much better by the end. But the principle of communication here is what I'm trying to get to. It's not just translation. It has to be accessible messaging, plain English, clear understanding, so it works for people with learning disability, with dyslexia, and then it's translated. And translation means not just the language, it has to do with digital literacy. Not everyone's going to check Facebook, and who knows what you'll see, because different people have different timelines. So you need a different way of interacting. For that circumstance, at least, it was very top-down. It was central, big decisions that impacted a lot of people. Then the whole communication ecosystems needs to be provided with what it needs to do better. I don't think that was, well, we didn't talk about it. It's also the work we do when we talk to people doing consultations. You need to plan ahead, and the communication needs to be planned ahead.
Ideally, would you like to see some kind of central public body undertaking translations so that you were sure what the source of those were?
I think it would be good. It can't be the only source because that would create tons of problems. But if there was such a centrally, for circumstances like this, definitely would make sense. It would be really good to have something like that because then it creates a standard. And then all community groups, everyone in the local area can reinterpret this and look at how best to make it reach the audience that they work with. I think it would definitely help for this circumstance, yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Bhopal, a number of organisations have mentioned to us issues faced by a number of ethnic communities over the pandemic, incidents of hate or incidents of discrimination. Did you have any experience of that through your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think anecdotally we heard a lot about some of the issues that communities were facing during the pandemic. I think a lot of the issues that existed pre-pandemic were clearly exacerbated during the lockdowns and have maybe been potentially heightened post-pandemic as well. Just on the subject of vaccines, for example, there were a lot of people that we were engaging with who mentioned that they were hesitant to obtain immunisation or vaccination due to previous negative experiences from health services that they were engaging with, which had really acted as a deterrent in terms of them wanting to be part of the uptake. So there was a lot of sort of consultation on our part with those people who were concerned or worried about engaging with the NHS, for example, on why it was so important to obtain these vaccinations and to give them the moral support to go ahead and do that. I guess the pandemic opened up a whole can of worms when it came to pre-existing issues that were already affecting the communities that we were serving. There was a general lack of faith and trust in various authorities, which was probably again acting as a deterrent as to why people were being reluctant to take the vaccination, and that would be from sources within our political sphere and also within the mainstream media across the UK as well. It's important as well, I think, for us to be mindful of the fact that access to vaccinations was dependent on individuals' mobility, their family life, whether they had access to community assistance, And something that we would hear quite regularly from people that we were supporting was the fact that they were having to access public transport to access their vaccinations or visit their GPs or visit their hospitals. And that spoke to a broader issue of everyday racism that people were facing pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and also post-pandemic as well. A lot of people that we were engaging with were talking about the fear of using public transport, for example, because of the fact they had negative experiences of being victims of racism, hate crime or discrimination. And that essentially had the knock-on effect on people's ability or willingness to travel to those GP appointments or hospital appointments. So it just goes to show that the psychological effects of racism can then have knock-on physical effects. And that's something that I think we need to be mindful of going forward if a situation like this was to arise again.
Thank you. Mr Mackay, Mr Bhopal's highlighted for one protected characteristic difficulties accessing services, health services in particular. You mentioned in your statement another protected characteristic insofar as trans health. I wonder if you could expand upon that for us. Sure, yeah.
So our casework service had worked with a few people impacted by that. So basically, trans people were finding that some of the gender affirming healthcare that they would have accessed prior to the pandemic just was not available, and that caused a great deal of distress for people. And it wasn't always clear, like what was going to be available or how long they might have to wait. And I think the uncertainty was a big difficulty for people there. There was a lot of understanding that these were exceptional times, that they're, to prioritise, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when people with COVID were particularly ill, that I think people understood that resources were being diverted to that. But I think in hindsight, things could have probably been communicated better, and there could have probably been more understanding around the impact on the trans community for accessing services.
Do you know, and forgive me if you don't, Mr Mackay, but do you know if that has had any long-term impacts for the community?
I mean, I can think of like one example where the delay in accessing services that had a particularly detrimental impact on a person's mental health and well-being, and I think it's fair to say that they continue to struggle with the impact of that to this day, although they have been able to access some of the care that they weren't able to access during the pandemic. That delay in accessing it was significant and impactful, and I'm sure that's not an isolated incident, but it's the only specific example that I have experience of. But.
Thank you. Dr Haney, Mr Mackay's mentioned mental health there. Did you come across and did you provide any assistance in respect of mental health aspects for the community?
We did come across a lot of that, both as individuals working to support communities and having to hear people who were in dire conditions, almost facing destitution, was not easy on a personal level for any of the staff members who have to deal with that, but also from the communities itself, the broader effect on that, whether it being the isolation or the compound effects of the whole thing of the pandemic and later on the cost of living crisis. A lot of people lost their jobs. Not everybody was capable of accessing or getting furlough. There was a lot of issues surrounding that, but isolation mainly was one of them. It didn't help the whole racial element of things was in targeting particular communities also added to that. So there are communities who have always been racialized, but unfortunately that had sort of become a lot more evident during COVID, and that also compounded the effect of mental illness on a lot of communities. The role that we played was through being able to supply certain funds to support certain individuals and communities and families with mental well-being. Those funds came from the Scottish Government, but they were delivered to us via BEMIS mainly. There's a few of them that we've received, but it wasn't for the organisation itself. It was mainly as an intermediary who could identify people who were in dire need, of which we had a few, obviously, but we needed to prioritise based on the whole demographic of the circumstances of the family, themselves, how many people were affected, how many children within that family, were there long-term issues, were they shielding? There were so many factors that we had to take into consideration to prioritise, which was an awful lot to deal with in a personal capacity, obviously, as that was not one of the roles of the team to start with. It was not one of the projects that we run. It was just an added thing that we had to do, but we had to do it because that's how you respond to communities when you're one of them. When you are aware of what they go through, you can't split that or separate it. And through those funds that we've received, we managed to support a lot of families with either monetary support, cash injections, or to help with referrals to online mental well-being support. I think that also was through BEMIS. Some of them, I think for a couple of service users, we managed to support them by providing free, sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can find where I've put that in my statement.
Are you thinking of the wellness packs or?
Not the wellness packs, no, I was meaning more of the professional services, I've lost my word.
The counsellors?
Counselling services,
yes.
Thank you. So they've had about, I think, 12 sessions of counselling services each. The wellbeing packs were mainly for the children, to give them activities and things that were suited to their age and stage, and again, to support them. So it was various things that we were able to do because of the extra funding that we managed to secure to help individuals in those conditions.
And you mentioned funding and one of the funds, and you mentioned isolation, and one of the funds that you had was to address loneliness, as I understand it.
Right.
The Tackling Loneliness and Isolation Fund kind of does exactly what it says on the tin, really. You mentioned also giving support to families, but I was struck when I read your statement that you also highlighted that not everyone has families, and in fact, I wonder if you could expand upon that for us.
So the ethnic minority groups, obviously, the majority of almost all of our service users are from ethnic minority groups. But we say that because we, as a human rights and equality organisation, abide by the legal definition of ethnic minorities. That is the legal definition of what is encompassed within the race, which is unfortunately one of the biggest issues that we had throughout the whole pandemic, because what we have always believed in and abided by in the legal definition of race included ethnicity, included your national origin, included citizenship. We did not feel that that was reflected in the whole approach during COVID. But we stick to what we are morally and legally bound by as an organisation, as humans. And within those categories, there is... could you say the question again? Sorry, I knew I was going to link that.
I was asking about isolation for people who didn't have families.
So the variation within that was that there are certain categories of those communities who would be completely on their own with absolutely no family support, no networks whatsoever around them. The isolation in there is huge. On the other hand, you have groups of ethnic minority backgrounds who have hugely extensive families. You're talking about households with 9 members of the family in the same household. huge overcrowdedness there. So there's a massive variation within, and I'm talking about a relatively small demographic within Scotland, if you think about it, and I'm sure that's not unique to our area. It's just to show the variety of what you deal with and what you come across and the experiences within those. The Scottish Government would have seen all of that as the same group. They're all ethnic minorities. They're all within the same lens, if that makes sense. We don't believe that, because when you talk about someone who had been on their own, say a single parent with a young child under 5 in their household, and absolutely nobody and nowhere to go. They've got to go to work. They can't go to work. They're not classed as key workers, so they can't have the access to the extra provision that was provided. But then again, they've got to make sacrifices of whether they reduce their working hours and significantly reduce their income as such, and raising their own child at the same time, who wouldn't be at the age where they would be in school to start with, that would have been the nursery age. That complexity is not replicated in families within larger numbers within them. Not to say that the overcrowdedness over there didn't impact, but the impact is different. It is also huge within larger numbers of the families, the larger families of multiple children in the household who all needed access to digital life when schools had moved to being remote. Not everybody had that. Not every school could provide this. There's lots of differences there, but the impact was huge nonetheless.
Do you think these, I think it was perhaps implicit from something you said a moment ago, but do you think the Scottish Government understood that diversity?
Never. I don't for a second believe that they did.
Did the Central Scotland Regional Equality Council take any particular steps to raise concerns about disproportionate impact on minority communities with the Scottish Government?
Not directly with them, but via the network that was established by BEMIS, which was right at the start of the pandemic. We maintained that very positive relationship and communication with everybody. We were there at those meetings on a monthly basis. I think that sometimes it was more than once a month. I think we were doing them bi-weekly within the network. So for reference, that's the Ethnic Minority National Resilience Network that was established by BEMIS and led on by BEMIS, but with membership organisations from across Scotland. And we've constantly, were there at every discussion that was had, at every topic. We've raised those issues continuously. Some of them were taken on board, some of them we don't believe aligned very much with the, I don't know, whatever the direction was, but some of them were taken on board, but none, not all of them. And we still don't believe that there was a clear understanding from the Scottish Government on the variations within the minority groups. We believe that there's a lot of lumping up, basically, if you like, of certain groups together under the same label, which we believe is fundamentally wrong.
Mr. Boyle, if I can perhaps pick on some of that lumping with you. His Lordship has heard evidence previously regarding refugees and asylum seekers, many of whom will fall within ethnic minority groups. Again, can I ask what steps were taken, or did you take any steps to flag concerns with the Scottish Government about disproportionate impacts on that group?
Yeah, I mean, more so through my role with the Scottish Refugee Council, so I was quite privileged in that sense to be part of Wesrick and the Scottish Refugee Council during the pandemic, so wherever I could I would take learning in from Wesrick, from the other regional equality councils, and bring that into any partnership meetings that I would be having with Scottish Government or local authorities. I mean, for me, something that I would raise quite regularly during that period was the fact that a refugee, for example, is entitled to the same social and economic rights as any UK citizen, and often refugees and asylum seekers would be lumped together in the same conversation when it comes to migration. But when we look at the rights of asylum seekers in comparison to refugees, the situation's very different and very complex. So a person seeking asylum is someone who's asked the government to recognise their refugee status and is still waiting to hear the outcome of their application. And those seeking asylum don't have the same rights and entitlements as refugees because of restrictions applied under UK immigration legislation, rules and policy. So people seeking asylum can access services in Scotland such as healthcare and education whilst they await their decision from the Home Office, but they still can't work, choose where they live or access a vast majority of financial benefits, including universal credit, and are provided with less than the sum of £50 per week for the purchase of basic necessities such as food, toiletries and clothing. And nothing really changed during the period of pandemic. So when you have asylum seekers being categorised in the same group as minority ethnic communities more broadly, including those from a refugee background, you can see how ridiculous it is almost to have them there. For me personally, I think that if anything similar was to occur in the future, then additional provision or unique provision should be made for that particular group of people to assist their special needs and recognise their unique vulnerability. Something which is often talked about, I mean, still to this day, is the fact that a lot of asylum seekers were housed in hotel accommodation during the pandemic, and they still are just now. These are some of our society's most vulnerable people fleeing war, persecution and torture. To have little access to public service support, limited financial support, no prospect of employment, very little engagement with the outside community is problematic at the best of times, but during a pandemic, when there's further restrictions enforced on you, we can only imagine how difficult people would have found grappling with their mental health and grappling with previous experiences of trauma. I stayed in a tenement flat during the pandemic and found that tough enough, but to stay in a windowless hotel room with that past experience and that past trauma would have been unimaginable for someone like myself.
You've mentioned there, Mr. Babal, the severe mental health impacts which some asylum seekers were facing. Again, did you have the opportunity in your privileged role to feed that back to government?
Yeah, I mean, we were part of various working groups, so we were lucky enough to speak with Scottish Government representatives from Police Scotland. The Mears Group were there, who were the private contractors dealing with the accommodation. So myself and colleagues from the Refugee Council, other charities across the third sector would feed that information back. But I think what we really saw during the pandemic was the power of community working at a grassroots level to provide support. So whilst more prominent agencies like the Refugee Council and other equality organisations were able to provide that concrete feedback to key partners, it was grassroots voluntary groups or individuals even attending hotels and giving out food or giving out sanitary products, speaking to people within that hour or two when they had the opportunity to do so, that were really leading the charge in terms of necessary and vital support for those people.
When you gave that feedback, did the Scottish Government give you any particular response?
I mean, in all honesty, my role at the time with the Refugee Council wasn't in a senior management position, but I'd imagine that more senior members of staff within the Refugee Council and other organisations would have given that feedback, and from my own experience of working with Scottish Government in that capacity, that was listened to. Whether it was always acted upon is a different question, but definitely there were keen ears in the room whenever I was privy to conversations or whenever I was able to input my own thoughts and experience.
Mr. Honoré, looking back on the pandemic and the decisions that were taken and the experiences that you and your organisation had, do you feel that equality issues were sufficiently considered during the pandemic?
Well, I always would think they could have been considered a lot better. That's a short answer to that one. There's so much that can be put in place that doesn't need to be invented, if that makes sense. A lot of barriers people face are known, well documented in different versions, but they're not necessarily integrated. So for me, I'm trying to take this a lesson-centered approach. There's no point to go into blame or whatsoever, but there's so much that's already known in the inclusion field. There's just so many things that are, there's not just decades, there's centuries of knowledge about what does it mean to be displaced, what does it mean to have barriers of communication, what does it mean to have a disability, what does it mean to have combinations of factors that make it very hard for you to reach out necessarily, and that you might need someone to actually pay attention and turn the table around, not default on, oh, that person will need help, they will reach out. Actually, no, for quite a few folk, that's not really feasible, and it's not new. And so for me, I would think with all the body of knowledge that exists, whether it's in public policy or academia, we could actually do much better. I wouldn't be doing my job if I said it was perfect already anyway, but I think we could do a lot better. And I mirror what my panel members just said there. It's very true. The impact on mental health was massive. Isolation was massive for certain groups of people, and the lumping together is very blunt. You can't have a blunt response to something like this, which is about the human condition. It has to be adaptive to what's happening. I think that's what really surprised me in terms of some of the responses. It's like, we already know so much better. How can the response be so blunt? It was really odd. We don't have time to just think about it, just have to deal with situations. But the lumping together a minority ethnic group as one homogeneous group, that's a bit ridiculous. It doesn't take long to know this, but it doesn't work. And that happens for all kinds of things. It's not because someone is from a minority ethnic group that they will be in a difficult situation. Some people have other factors that put them in very resilient positions, might it be because of work or their situations, their family connections, their social and their social capital, and all. So there's combinations of factors. But similarly, there's a combination of factors that put people at a lot of risk, a lot of harm, quite easily. And having a public policy system that understands and responds to that would be way more finely tuned and way better at responding to things like pandemics or any panic or whatsoever. So, yeah, that's what I would think would be a good thing to learn from.
One of the ways which government can consider equality is obviously an equality impact assessment. Dr. Hani, were you aware of any equality impact assessments being done by government during the pandemic, or did you make any inquiries as to whether they had been doing any?
We have asked the question. We don't believe that there was any done at the time.
Mr. Bhopal, have you any, with your inside knowledge, can you enlighten us any better?
We actually didn't make the inquiry. I think if anything like this was to happen in the future, we would definitely look to do that. But no, at the time, we never asked anything of the government in relation to that.
I'm conscious of the time. Time flies. Unfortunately, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to come to each now in turn, if I may. If there's anything that you particularly would like to raise with His Lordship, either that we've spoken about already, or indeed you've mentioned, all of you, various lessons which you think His Lordship should consider. All of that will, of course, be taken into account in terms of your statement, but if there's anything you would particularly like to focus upon, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that. And perhaps I could come, Mr. Mackay, just because you are largest in my sight, if I could perhaps come to you first.
Sure. I suppose maybe conscious of time as well, but I suppose the things I would look to highlight. I think the focus on digital literacy, particularly important. The pandemic really highlighted it, but it continues to be an issue beyond and before the pandemic, as we've increasingly moved towards digital services. there's a community of people who are being left behind by that, where there's not sufficient work being done or opportunities being created for people to access digital literacy that meets their needs. I suppose it would also highlight the sort of general concern we would have that the pandemic shone a light on lots of issues, and it feels like we haven't done enough to apply the lessons learned to the future, and I worry that, like, you know, that's a missed opportunity to learn from and have some positive legacy. I suppose the other one I was keen to mention, it hasn't really come up much. It's been mentioned a little bit around like vaccine hesitancy and things, but just the climate of mis and disinformation. I think it's really important as a society, but for the Scottish Government to have a role in addressing that. And, you know, there's lots of ways we can do that. Greg's involved in lots of initiatives around like myth busting. We do a lot of work in schools, but I think a more sort of concerted effort around critical media literacy would be beneficial, again, beyond the pandemic, particularly the communities of people that Greg work with a lot, so migrant communities, and increasingly facing more and more barriers, challenges, prejudice and discrimination, and a lot of that is related to just the hostile media environment that we're all operating in, and how much mis and disinformation there are about not just those communities, but that is a community that Greg works with closely, and so it's the one that we're probably most experienced around. We haven't probably as a society been able to reconcile with the speed of the development of the internet and social media and the changing nature of how we're all interacting around those things. And so I think some real effort around that would be beneficial for us all.
Thank you. Dr. Hani, if I could come to you next.
I think if I would summarise, there's lots to be learned. There's lots that we can do, both as individuals, as organisations, as government. Prevention is the first thing that I've put down in my recommendations, what lessons should be learned. But under prevention, there's a lot that comes under that title itself, because prevention would come from knowledge. And knowledge comes from, you know, what you've experienced, what you've gathered, and how you've communicated that. And if we're not, a lot of the guidance that came from the government was informed by the data collected. And if we're not going to address the all the issues that were raised about how the data was collected, was it the most accurate that we could have done? What can we do to improve, to then influence the policies and the guidance that is released? We're not going to be prepared, and it's not going to help with the whole prevention element. So it is one big thing, but there's so many different elements within that need to be taken into consideration. For the disintegration of the data is a must, so that we understand the differences between those cultures, those communities, those experiences, acknowledge them, but also learn from them. And unless we do that in disintegration of the data, we're not going to learn anything. And unfortunately, there won't be a way forward as we go. Communication comes next, because a lot of this could have been improved upon if the communication was clearer, if it was more simple, and if it was addressed to deal with all the intersectionalities of, you know, those who are less literate in the digital world, or those who are actually illiterate in their own mother tongue, or the age gap that have got between different groups within the same communities. There's so much that can be done to improve upon the communication and make it a lot easier and a lot clearer. And of course, it's not to dismiss the recognition of all of those cultural differences, to talk to the people who are day on, day out living those experiences as individuals, as organizations, providing the support on the ground. There's no benefit to anybody if we keep working in our separate ways. Things are a lot better when we work together and listen to one another and understand.
Thank you. Mr. Honoré.
I think I'll echo that communications. I think I've said it many times in my statement as well. Communications is the mainstay, I would think. Really understanding what inclusive communication is about, really implementing it, and being okay to learn about it. that's really, you could have done, could have managed this whole situation so much differently through doing this. And that's, again, I echo what was said, it's got to do not just with translation, it's got with clarity of a message. If a person wants to issue a message, we need to think about making it clear at the source, not afterwards. That introduces so much, and this is what Ross was saying, it introduced so much mistrust, capacity for false information, and social media was used to create all kinds of nonsense that you couldn't debunk. So that has to be prioritized, I would say, in order to do this. But it's not only one-way that communication. I think I put that in my statement. It has to be, there has to be designed for when something gets communicated. There is a forum, a way of reinterpreting it at community level. But people can say, what do you mean by this? What's going on at a large scale? There was a lot of public workers or charity workers doing Teams meetings with thousands of people online with one source of information. Everyone more or less got a understanding of what's being done. We did that for people working. We never really did this for communities. And people need to take in information, digest it, come out with some, do you mean this, or come out with things that they need to be challenged on that spot, and that's the natural process. But that was not really thought out as much. We all went in panic mode, intervention mode, we just did stuff and just got on with it. But actually that would have removed a lot of misinformation, and there's been a lot of it. It's been rampant, so that's definitely a problem. The other side, I would say, is, is protecting, really identifying who are your key workers and protecting them, making sure they're okay. There's a lot of people there who are minoritized, who are key workers, and who are being targeted, light level or even worse, and really protecting key workers at that time and defining who that is really important, so that we can actually move on and deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Bhopal.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think intersectionality must be taken more seriously when planning how to best support communities in any future situations. So as we've touched on, within minority ethnic communities, within that sphere, some suffer more than others due to various reasons, and that can cover proficiency in being able to speak, read or write English, where someone stays in terms of their geography. They could be more socially isolated than others, their socio-economic status, which is something we've not really touched upon today, and also the crossover across each of the protected characteristics covered by the Equality Act. So our discussion today is focused a lot on race and ethnicity. People who are minoritised or racialised have crossover in terms of other protected characteristics, so being more mindful of the experiences of those with different sexual orientations, those living with disabilities, being mindful of how an experience for a woman might be different from a man, and also consider age as well as part of any other future conversation around the subject. Also, I wanted to highlight the fact that the structural inequalities around public health should be considered in more depth in future as well. Minority ethnic groups had disproportionately higher rates of hospitalisation during COVID-19. That was well documented and reported on publicly. There's a number of different research studies that was produced by Public Health Scotland which backed this up, and that indicated various examples of structural and institutional racism, as well as the everyday racism, discrimination and inequality faced by minority ethnic people in Scotland. And that sort of detail, that research, those studies, they can help policymakers and government understand better how underemployment, unemployment, poorer housing and discrimination from mainstream services affects public health outcomes. Neil Gray was the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care at the time of making this statement, said that the long-standing harm caused by racism was highlighted again during the pandemic, and as a result the Scottish Government recognised racism as a significant public health challenge. So just going back to what was said at that time during that period post-pandemic, I think that more has to be done by the government to listen to the lived experience of minority ethnic people, continue to speak out openly on challenging racism, and also encourage public health bodies such as the NHS to do more to address those issues and address structural inequalities as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My Lord, unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all very much. We break now for lunch and come back at, let me make sure I get this right, 1:30.